Well, hello there, everyone. Sorry there. Welcome to my first video. I've never done this sort of thing before, so I'm not really sure what to do, but I hope you'll all enjoy it. So, if you're watching this, you're probably a Sonic fan. I mean, why wouldn't you be watching this then? So, I've heard this before that since the franchise has gone through so many different iterations, it seems that a lot of fans stick to one specific part. Sure, they'll enjoy some other parts of it, the franchise, but there's just one specific thing that really hits them harder than everything else. And for me, that's gotta be the Archie comics. Yeah, I know, these are a little controversial. Sonic's Sally, yada yada. Yeah, look, I've heard that talk 1,000 times before, and I'm sick of it. You don't have to like this comic, but I do. I know thousands, probably millions of other people do. So, today, for my first video, I'm just going to walk you through elements that I think really make this comic a magical brilliance. To start, let's start with the intro, of course. So, this comic had quite the history. As you can see, the covers, there's one from 2008, one from 2010, and one from 2011. Some really classic covers here. Tracy Yardley and Patrick Spaziante stuff. Enter Jack Reborn, The Silver Saga, Sonic Genesis. So, I got into this comic not necessarily because I loved it or anything, but more so I just thought this is really interesting. I want to see more of this, and eventually I did see more of this, and I got hooked. It's really good. That's all I really have to say for the intro. It might sound a little short, but that's all I got to say. Anyway, I'd like to start off with the most important part of the comic, the characters. I love the characters in this comic. Aside from Amy and Rouge, I'd say this has the best versions of every single Sonic character. But especially Sonic, who I'm going to start off with, of course. Got a picture of Sonic and Super Sonic from Tracy Yardley. There's a whole video that goes in depth why Archie Sonic's the best Sonic on that specific subject. It's really good, but I think one of my favorite parts of this version of Sonic is that he's got a lot more to him than he usually does. You see in Sonic Adventure 2, I love that version by the way. He's more cocky, he's confident, but he still gets serious. Something like Sonic 06, which I don't hate that game by the way, but I don't like that version of Sonic. He's just so boring. He just talks like this. That's why people always do impressions of Jason Griffith's Sonic. His voice is just kind of stilted. Nothing is not an insult at Jason Griffith. I know he's got a lot of fans, but I just think his Sonic voice is pretty stilted. Or you'd see in something like Sonic Forces, he just makes endless quips nonstop that are really annoying and it's also supposed to be inspiring somehow. And then in Frontiers, he's better, but he's just missing something. But it doesn't count all other stuff like the terrible IDW portrayal. Oh my gosh, that version is awful. And the movie portrayal where he's just shown to be a stupid kid. But here he's shown to have a lot more sides of him. He's cocky, he's cool, he's confident, he's sad, he's angry, he cares about his friends a lot. He's a walking disaster magnet, as it's been put in the comic. He has romances, which, boy, that's a whole other thing for another part of the video. There's a lot to this version. I really like this version. I understand if not everybody thinks this is the best version of Sonic. Some people might say Black Knight or SA2, but this is just my favorite version. Next, we've got the comics core cast, the Freedom Fighters, who of course originate from Sad AM but appeared here first. I know at least one of these characters especially is quite a heated debate in the fandom, and that's Sally, who of course is on the left, and I really like Sally. Yeah, she started off a little rough, had a lot of rough stories, but I like Sally. I mean, she had a lot of personality, especially with Ian Flynn writing her, even a bit from Romy Chacombe, whoever that actually is. It's just a pen name, obviously. And well, I think the reboot, which I'm not really going to talk about because I don't want to, definitely butchered her to be just really bland, not even do much. And some of her earlier stories, like I said, there wasn't much to them. But Sally's got a lot going on. I guess I can get into that later when we get to the romance section of this video, but that's for another time. There's over here, Bunny Rabbit, the cyborg who is just Rogue from the X-Men, but Sonicified, and hey, I like Rogue. I know a lot of people do. Being she's Southern and she has some kind of thing going on with her. As in Rogue, she couldn't touch anyone without a glove because else she'd put a guy in a coma. And for Bunny, she's partially roboticized, which means she was quite useful in a lot of the action scenes, which, yeah, I liked Bunny. No, there's not too much to say about her. I mean, there was the whole thing about her family later on in the comic, but there's really not much to say about her, honestly. Just, I like her. Who doesn't? Then there's Antoine, who is quite something. Yeah, if you watched Sad AM, you probably know he's annoying. Everybody thinks he's annoying in Sad AM. I don't think he's that bad. I mean, he was voiced by Rob Paulson, which is definitely makes him a little better than other people would say. But in the comic, he starts off as Low Art put it in his Archie comic retrospective, which is amazing. He starts off as a coward with a heart of gold, then a hardened warrior, then a guy who just stands around and does nothing, then a coward again, except now he has absolutely zero faith in himself. Then a hardened warrior once more, except, oh, it's actually his evil twin from another dimension. And then he finally gets some proper development where he's able to overcome his cowardice, but still be a little cowardly, be useful, be serious, but still be comedic. And yeah, that's what I like about Antoine. He was able to overcome his cowardice, but and still be able to acknowledge all his flaws, and those were a part of him. I think that's pretty interesting. But then there's Rotor, who is, yeah, Rotor is one of the most boring characters in the comic. There's a reason he does almost nothing in season 2 of Sad AM. He just stands around there and occasionally talks. And in the comic, he was originally the smart one, before Tails became the smart one. So, but even then, he didn't really do much. He was mostly just a plot device and would just be there. I don't hate him or anything, but he just didn't really do much. And then you get these stupid scenes from him, like where he made that gigantic gun with a million different features written by Ken Penders. And then in a story, okay, it was years later, I might not have remembered it, but Ken Penders wrote another story where he just tells Fiona Fox, "Oh, Fiona, freedom fighters don't use guns of any kind. Never have, never will. It's just not our way." Yeah, I don't think so. He does get better, of course, under Ian Flynn, which happens to a lot of the characters. And there isn't really much to say about him there either. It's just, I mean, he became a counselor, then he became the leader of Team Freedom, and I guess his role got expanded. He got more interesting, but there's just not much to say about Rotor, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. He's just a lot less interesting compared to his fellow freedom fighters. But next, we have the villains. The only time Sonic has a rogues gallery. Well, I think he has one in Fleetway, but I've never read Fleetway, so I wouldn't know. And start off, Eggman, or Robotnik, or Robo-Robotnik, or whatever you want to call him. This is the best Eggman. I know he's great in SA2, in SA1, and I don't know, Unleashed, I guess. And I like him in the Boom TV show a lot anyway, he's great there, but this is the best version because, ignoring that the whole Robo-Robotnik thing, he's the same person as the original Robotnik. This version of Eggman is by far the most evil. They're not trying to make him sympathetic like they did in Frontier. They're not trying to just make him a complete lunatic like in the movies, which I think went a little too far in that regard. He's not just kind of boring like he was in Sonic 06. And he's not just a joke like he was in Sonic Colors. This version is actually scary. He took over the world, actually took over the world, and like in Sonic Forces where he's supposed to, but all you just see is some cities on fire. That doesn't really tell us anything. You get to see how far his influences reach and how many people it's hurt. You get to see how demonic he is. I mean, the ending of Snively's story is quite something to behold. He locks him up in a pod. He's finally done with putting up with everything Snively's done. Says, "I'm the only one who knows you're here, and I'm not going to let you out." Game over, Snively. Looks one panel of just him just looking at the pod, reflecting on all the times he's had torturing Snively. Then he just walks away with a grin on his face and says, "Thanks for playing." That's dark. And I also like that the comic would sometimes switch between Eggman and Robotnik, because, yeah, it was always called Robotnik, and you see in Sonic Adventure, he's usually Eggman, but sometimes he's called Robotnik. That's what they stuck with, which I think was a much better idea. And as much as I don't like the movies, I think I am glad they're sticking with that decision anyway. Let's you remember that this is Robotnik, not just Eggman. This is the guy that took over the world and did all sorts of crazy stuff. Then there's Scourge the Hedgehog, who I'm going to get into him later. Just showing a picture of him right now because he's cool. Then there's Dr. Finitivis, Knuckles' arch rival, because here Knuckles has a rogues gallery in and of himself, which isn't that big, but there's a lot to say about Dr. Definitivus. How there are two ways he can be interpreted in his origin. Either he's a self-fulfilling prophecy of the echidnas and their hubris, which I think is a lot more interesting than him being an anti-Knuckles, which works, but I think the former is more interesting than the latter. Still, though, there's a lot to say about Dr. Definitivus. You learn about him, but there's still a lot that's hidden in mystery, where he really came from, what he's really done. So it keeps you invested, yet you're never really sure what his end game is exactly, which I think is quite interesting. It keeps, as I said, it keeps you engaged, keeps you invested, it makes you want to know what's going to happen next. Oh, and he created warp rings, which is why he has rings all over him, which now warp rings seem to be a staple of the franchise because they made it into the movies and they even made it kind of into Sonic Frontiers, which that's always good to know. Shows these comics aren't completely forgotten, which for someone like me and a lot of other people, that's nice. Next, there are his other two villains of the comic, Ixis Nagus, who you might recognize from SatAM as just Nagus, and Mammoth Mogul. Ixis Nagus is quite something. He has a relatively convoluted backstory. It's not super convoluted, more so it's just really weird. So I'm not going to get into that now, but there's a lot to say about him. Because you see, Eggman is usually Sonic's arch rival. He's a scientist, a mad scientist, and technological threat. Ixis Nagus is magical, which I think is pretty interesting. And all the stuff he goes through, because yeah, in his first story arc, The World Adventure, he's not awful, he doesn't really get to do anything. Because his entire fight just is narrated endlessly by captions, which I love captions, but a comic should have speech bubbles and maybe some silent panels just so actions speak louder than words, but he gets way better when he gets reintroduced almost 100 issues later in the Darkest Storm arc, where he doesn't do much, but he's interesting. He's a lot more of a presence there. And then he gets to become practically the villain alongside Eggman, even if he's not working with him toward the end of the comic. But since the comic was rebooted, we'll never really get to see where that went, unless you go to Archie Sonic Online by the fans, which is great. Then there's Mammoth Mogul. Oh boy. Yes, he just looks like the Kingpin, but a mammoth, and I love that. His origin is weird. I think it's supposed to be inspired by Vandal Savage from DC. He was just a primitive hunter during the Ice Age, I guess, or something like that, some kind of prehistoric time. He touched a Chaos Emerald and became immortal and super powerful and smart. And while that sounds interesting, his first few stories, a lot of them, all he does is just talk in big words, walk around and say how powerful he is, except pretty much every time he's there, and those are all their stories, he's drawn terribly and written very boringly. Not because because I don't like having a bunch of words on the page, I like that, but when you just have a guy endlessly drone on and on about how great he is, that just gets really boring, and he's not really threatening then, because he just does the same thing over and over again. Twice in the Knuckles comic, he just randomly shows up out of nowhere and takes Dimitri's spot as the main antagonist. Well, first as the main villain, then as the main antagonist, except, Mammoth Mo was actually a villain. Dimitri was an antagonist in that story, not a villain. But both times, he just shows up completely out of nowhere. First time, you've only ever seen him twice. And then you just see him for a single panel plotting in the shadows of the Knuckles comic, and then he just shows up, steals Enerjac's power, and becomes the main villain. And then you think he's going to get to fight Super Sonic, Hyper Knuckles, and Turbo Tails, which, yes, they just used Hyper in place of Super for Knuckles because they want to distinguish him. I like that. But anyway, you think that's going to be amazing, but it's really bad. The art does not do that Super Form Battle Royale justice. Then he shows up again when Dimitri and the Dark Legion are all talking with the Kidnopolis Council, and then you could just see him occasionally. Okay, it's more than one panel than before, but you'll just see him occasionally show up riding around in a taxi to get to Dimitri for some reason. And then he just kidnaps him and tells Knuckles, if you don't get down here, I'm going to kill your uncle. Which is weird. And then Knuckles dies in that story, which is that's a whole other can of worms. This all makes it sound like he's lame, but he gets a lot better. Once you get to the Darkest Storm arc, where he, in typical comic book supervillain fashion, gets cosmic-esque powers like Doctor Doom always does, Except he's once again defeated, except this time in an actually cool way where he actually looks scary and doesn't just endlessly babble on about who knows what for 3 whole pages straight. And then he gets locked up in prison, where you see him occasionally talk to Sonic, saying stuff like during the House of Cards when he's fighting Tails, "What shall it be, the hero defeated by a pup, or the great hero who beats up children?" Just a line like that really gets across that this guy is actually kind of scary. He's actually getting under Sonic's skin. And then you get to the Mogul Rising arc, which is really good, where he just figures out, without breaking the fourth wall or being super meta, that he can't win. Because it was said earlier in the comic that Mammoth Mogul was cursed to always lose in the last minute. So he figures that if I can't beat you, I can't beat you. Okay, so it says he marked Tails, Mighty, yes, because Mighty's in the comic a lot actually, and Mina Mongoose to, I guess, control them and then have them attack Sonic. I really like this issue for one specific scene that I've never heard anyone talk about. Sonic is winning against that because I doubt them being mind controlled they'd be at their strongest, and Sonic is Sonic, and he gets a little help. And just as he's winning, he tells Mammoth Mogul, "It's over, Mogul. You can't win." And he just creepily says through Mighty's voice, "Not with conventional fisticuffs, it would seem, but there are other chinks to your armor." Which I guess people have talked about what he kind of means by this without actually mentioning this line, but I just really like that line. It shows that he knows that maybe you can't beat Sonic in a fist fight, but there are other chinks to Sonic's armor. Sonic is not invincible. He's got weaknesses, and he plans to exploit those. And eventually, he just opens his own casino and becomes a legitimate businessman, which is never said, but I'm sure that's what was implied. Where he pretty much just becomes the leader of an underground criminal empire and just occasionally shows up. We even see him in the future as Silver's mentor because he's immortal. That's all I really got to say about Mammoth Mogul. He went for being pretty lame to being really cool, which is definitely a good thing. Most comic books, especially if you look at stuff like Marvel, when they started back in the 60s, they were great, but as time went on, they just got worse and worse and worse until they just got so bad that they're practically unbearable. But this comic, no, it always had some good stories here and there, then it eventually got amazing, which is definitely makes it stand out. Next, I want to talk about some of the video game characters that got adapted. As I said, it has my favorite version of every game character, except for Amy and Rouge. So start off with Tails. Tails is really good here. He's smart, but he's not portrayed as necessarily technologically smart, which he is, but more so as he builds things. He's an inventor, a mechanic, kind of like in Sonic Boom. But there's a lot to Tails. You get to hear about his parents. You see when he and Sonic first met when he was just a baby. You see some of his own adventures. You see him grow up in more than just the story of Sonic Adventure, which I loved his arc in Sonic Adventure, but when you really get to see it developed over so long in the comic, it feels like it has more weight to it, which is very much appreciated. And he's never portrayed as a crybaby. He's never portrayed as the, "No, you trust Eggman more than me. Do you know how much that bites?" Like in Sonic Lost World or in Forces where he says, "Ah, chaos! Sonic, help me!" Oh gosh, that was a bad moment. Well, I guess I liked his arc in Frontiers. That felt very reaching when they literally have him say that I'm wildly inconsistent. Yeah, the fans know that. Can't you just have him act competent again and maybe have a few references to the past games? That would be nice. But I really like Archie Tales. He gets to go through a lot. I mean, he gets literally mentally tortured by Fiona Fox, which is there's definitely a lot to say about that subject, but that's a video in and of itself, and I don't really feel like talking about that. Then there's Knuckles, who got his own comic, except it was more like a Echidna comic that just happened to have Knuckles in it, because, yeah, look, I don't hate Ken Penders the way other people do, but in Knuckles' own comic, he's not the main character. Arguably, his father is Locke, and yeah, Locke's a very interesting character, but Knuckles always just got pushed to the sidelines. He had destiny forced upon him, a destiny he never wanted, which is really interesting. And if he actually got more focus and more development, it was really interesting. His friendship with the Chaotix, his relationship with Julie Sue and his father, meeting his long-lost mother, having to deal with his people's past and all the crazy stuff he goes through. It makes you feel bad for him. He has to go through so much stuff for most of his life he never even knew existed. He never even had any ideas of it. For a long time, he thought the only kins were him and his father. He never even thought about what happened to his mother or anything like that. He was just told by his father, "Oh, she's gone, son." And he never questioned that until the comic eventually gets to the Echidna War, which, yeah, in this comic, Knuckles isn't the last of his kind. You can say, but that's not accurate to the games, and so that's what adaptations are for. They give you a new perspective on things, and hey, I like Knuckles not being the last of his kind. Besides, not like there are a ton of echidnas. I mean, there are a fair bit of echidna characters, but there aren't as many echidnas as there are overlanders, or which are humans. They're not, but there aren't as many echidnas as I guess there are hedgehogs or foxes or whatever other animals there are. He just does a lot. For example, the comic actually answers, does Knuckles have spiked gloves or spiked fists? He was a genetically enhanced mutant that has spiked fists. Hey, it's a comic book, just go with it. And that's the kind of thing that would only happen in a comic book anyways. In a movie or a video game, you'd never get something as outlandish as that, which really makes you appreciate this a lot more. Then I'm just going to mention Mighty and Ray because, yeah, they appear in this comic and they get to be in it a lot. Now, Mighty was just there because the comic started in 1993, technically 1992, but so they did an adaptation, Knuckles Chaotix. So Mighty was there, and he just never left. The Chaotix never became the Vector SBO charming detectives you see in the games. No, they were just Knuckles' team, his own kind of freedom fighters, I guess. His buddies, his partners. And I really like that. That means Mighty was always there. And Mighty in Archie is great. He's portrayed as not a gentle giant, but more like he's just very laid back, but he's also probably the physically strongest guy on the planet, which is pretty funny. And there's a lot to him. You hear about his sister, which that story hit pretty hard emotionally. You get to hear how his parents were thieves and how he has to deal with this, and his brotherly bond with Ray, because yeah, Ray appears. Now, I don't know why Ray was even in it because he was added by Ken Penders, and Ken Penders didn't play the games, and Ray was never even in a game in America until 2018, aside from a few cameos in the 2010s. So I don't know how he would have even known about Ray, but he added him, and I really like Ray. He's a lot more like video game Charmy, except a little more serious. He's got a stutter like Porky Pig, which was pretty funny. And there's not much to say about Ray other than he gets one really great emotional moment toward the end of the comic before the reboot, which is great. And yeah, he and Mighty do appear in the reboot, which I'm pretty sure those designs are where you'd see those modernized designs of Mighty and Ray, where Ray has goggles and Mighty has stuff on his arms. I'm pretty sure those come from the comic. But yeah, not much to say about Mighty and Ray. They're just really good and show how far-reaching the comic was with its characters. And next, the last characters I want to discuss from the games are Silver the Hedgehog and Shadow the Hedgehog. Silver is, I think these days people like him more than they used to, but sadly he'll forever be haunted by "it's no use" memes and "take this" and the shape of his head, which, gosh, I hate that joke. But this Silver is just great. You get to see him come from the future. You get to see a lot of his future and how destroyed it is and how awful it is. There's no Iblis, but rather it's a complete wasteland. Sure, there are people, but you never really get to see many of them. You just see he's practically living in a post-apocalyptic world, and he doesn't even have any idea of where it really comes from. He's just told that 200 years ago, a traitor amongst the freedom fighters would cause all of this. And his whole arc is first he thinks, Sonic must be the traitor. He's the only one who has the power to do all this. He finds out it's not Sonic. He forgives him, but he comes back thinking it's Rotor. Finds out it's not Rotor. Then he thinks it's Antoine, which leads to an incredibly emotional moment in issue 235, which you should just read. In fact, you might have seen it even if you haven't read the comic or haven't read that much of it. And he gets trained by Mammoth Mogul apparently in the future, and Knuckles' grandson, I want to say. It's not entirely clear. I'm pretty sure he's supposed to be Knuckles' grandson, Edmund, who's kind of like Yoda, kind of like the rat, whatever the master was in Kung Fu Panda, Sifu. And yeah, he has two mentors that teach him a lot of important lessons. And I'm sure you've heard of the Silver Saga story where he fights Enerjack. That story is amazing. He has to learn an important lesson, which is just no matter how strong he is, sometimes you can't win. And winning in a battle, you can do more than just hit a guy. As he was told, use your head, boy, not just for all that glowing nonsense. He used Enerjack's power against him to win, and I thought that was pretty interesting. He did a lot, and the comic captured Silver's optimism and determination, which just hasn't really been captured outside of Sonic 06 in this, which I guess isn't really true, but that more so comes from Silver's lack of appearances. The only problem I have with Archie Silver is that he never gets to meet Blaze or even know she exists, but because I think their interactions could be really interesting in this context, which I'm not going to mention Blaze because all I can say is that she's pretty much just the same as she is in the Sonic Rush games. There's really not much to say about Archie Blaze. But then there's Shadow the Hedgehog, who, again, there's a great video on Archie Shadow, why Archie Shadow is the best Shadow by Low Art, which goes into the fact that he didn't actually know Maria for that long. In the games, he knew Maria for months, probably. In Archie, he probably knew her for an hour, maybe a little longer if I'm being generous. So that was the point. It wasn't that he lost a friend, his sister practically. It was that he lost someone who inspired him that he hardly even knew, never got the chance to know her. And that's pretty interesting in its own right. And this comic also portrays the fact that Shadow is a hero. He's not a villain. He's not an anti-hero. He is a hero, and that's that. It explains why he worked with Gunn, which the explanation works in 06 pretty well. Of course, it's never said in 06, but which you should probably be able to figure out why he works for Gunn there, but it's that he wants to protect the world. That's what he promised Maria, and Gunn, at the end of the day, has lots of resources to help him protect the world. So he has files, so he doesn't have to do research on his own. He has transportation. He gets a team. And yeah, you get to see a lot of Team Dark with Rouge and Omega, and how, yeah, I don't know what was going on with Rouge, this character in the comic, but she's very inconsistent. Omega, on the other hand, is pretty much just as lovable as he always is, except his story is a lot more emotional, which I know I've used that word a lot in this video, but yeah, you've got to read the Shadow Saga from Sonic Universe. That hits really hard for Omega. And Archie Shadow is just a lot of fun. You get to see him smile. You get to see him ride around his motorcycle, and he says, even though he doesn't need it, he really likes that bike, as he says. You see his determination, his seriousness. He gets to call Sonic Blue Hedgehog. Just always like that. And he just does a lot. And, well, not a ton, but whenever he's there, he always has a presence. He isn't shoved into every single story just because he's Shadow, so he's popular. No. If he wasn't needed, he wasn't going to be put in there. And that's what I liked about the comic. Your name being Shadow the Hedgehog, your name being Blaze the Cat, does not mean you get more screen time than other characters. And I appreciate that. Next, we're finally going to get to Scourge the Hedgehog, my favorite Sonic rival, or villain, or I guess both. There's a lot to say about Scourge the Hedgehog. I'm going to mostly skip over the details because that would take forever to go through. But in short, he is Surge before Surge and also actually cool. Yeah, if you know Surge and Scourge and think that Surge isn't a ripoff of Scourge, she is. She's just a female Scourge, except way less interesting and charismatic. But anyway, Scourge is just, originally, he was literally just Sonic with a leather jacket and dark glasses from an alternate dimension where he was anti-Sonic, or usually evil Sonic. It just depends on who was writing it, whatever his name was. But he admits himself that he was just a nuisance, practically a joke villain. Nobody really thought much of him. But then he became Scourge the Hedgehog off a boost from the Master Emerald that turned him green, and in short, it made him look like an OC. You might think, why should I take a character seriously who looks like an OC? But that's kind of the point. He was made to look like those cheesy OCs you'd see in the 2000s of, yes, I'm sure we have all seen the meme Cold Steel the Hedgehog, but that's the intention. He's made to look so ridiculous that you wouldn't think he's a threat, but he is. And he is entertaining too. He's genuinely charismatic, but he's also hateable. You get a story like Father and Son where you just get to see how almost broken he is mentally, except you never feel bad for him. Scourge is a horrible person. He conquered his world, beat up people, it's implied he murdered his parents, threatens Sonic's father, but eventually backs down after a good talking to, and there's a lot to say about Scourge. His arc in Sonic Universe, where he just gets completely beaten down, his spirit is broken, he's crushed, and he has to gain his confidence back, and it makes you root for a guy who is a terrible villain and a psychotic murderer, which is definitely takes talent, I'll tell you that. But he's just really interesting because of one line I've never heard anyone talk about, much like that Mammoth Mogul line. He gets arrested and he says, "Hey, you can write me up as an evil twin, mutation, whatever. But the truth is, I'm just Sonic the Hedgehog at his full potential." those are the last words he ever tells Sonic, and those are powerful because they mean that Scourge wants to be his own person. He doesn't just want to be evil Sonic. Yet at the end of the day, he's still obsessed with the idea that he is the perfect version of Sonic. And that's really interesting. It shows how conflicted he is inside almost, which again, this comic is able to make you think he's tragic, but you still don't feel any sympathy for him. He's totally evil. And that's really interesting. Oh, and the sharp teeth are just really funny with the red sunglasses that literally say Sega on them. Again, there's a lot to say about Scourge, but that's probably for another time. And I mean, these covers are awesome. The covers of issue 189 and 190 even combine. Always like that kind of stuff. Next, for chapter 2, we have the comic's style. So style as in, we all know what style is in Sonic. Stuff like that Yuji Uekawa artwork, which is emulated here on the cover of issue 160. Ian Flynn's first comic, in fact. So the comic had a unique sense of style. Everything looks cool a lot of the time. It's detailed, it's got edge, it's got flair. Look at the cover of issue 72. That's one of my favorite covers. The return of Robotnik. As Sonic looks at him on the TV screens, you can see Robotnik's laugh. The cover of issue 125, the 10th anniversary special, which, yeah, you can see it says an exclusive message by Yuji Naka. Oh boy, has our perception of him changed over the years. But you can see in the cover that it emphasizes that there were a lot of characters, a lot of them. And Sonic isn't the first character you probably look at. You probably look at Mina or Vector or Espio or Predator Hawk or someone. Then you see Sonic at the end, which shows how, as Low Art said, which, yeah, Low Art again, but the world of Archie Sonic is the main character. Even if Sonic is the main character, the real appeal of the comic is getting to see all these characters inhabit this massive world and how they make it up. I mean, I know they're trying to connect the game lore now, but the game will just never feel as coherent and consistent as the comic did with its world. Next is just the cover of issue 160, drawn by Patrick Spaziante, who also drew those previous two covers. This was Ian Flynn and Tracy Yardley's first issue. Great cover. It's very simple, but it's just nice. It looks cool, and there's probably people who have just seen this image and probably think Yuji Uekawa drew it. There's the Patrick Spaziante artwork of Supersonic that I am 99% sure, if you haven't read the comic, or even if you have, you probably think that Yuji Uekawa drew it. Then there's this just really cool cover from Sonic Universe of Knuckles and Dr. Finitivus battling, which I always like a cover like this. There's not much really to say about it, it just looks really cool. And we got on the character designs. I'm mostly going to be emphasizing Tracy Yardley since he is the best Sonic artist. Yes, I like him more than Yuji Uekawa, because he kind of captures, again, that flair, that edge, that style. Except he's got his own look to it, which sure, that comes from the inkers too, or the colorists. In this case, usually Jim Amash, who did a spectacular job inking the comic. But you can see just, that is, I think, the picture of Sonic. It's the definitive version of how he looks to me, and probably a few other people. You look at his smirk, the way he's running, the details in his shoes, or Scourge too, his design has just got so much going on, but it looks clean in a sense, even though it's kind of got cluttered, but kind of hard to say about Scourge's design. But again, it just looks cool. You can kind of see the Sonic in him, but you still see him as a separate character. Next, there's just these cool panels of Dr. Finitivus I felt like showing, which, yeah, I also want to emphasize the guy who colored a lot of these images, Jason Jensen. Tracy Yardley, Jim Almash, and Jason Jensen on the art team, when they worked together, the artwork was the best it's ever been. It was seriously amazing. You can see him phasing people throughout warp rings. You can see him experimenting on Remington and probably nearly killing him, which shows how twisted he is, but yeah. Then there's just this amazing panel of the Eggman's Egg Beater mech nearly killing Sonic. I mean, when you look at the art, you can see the beat down in his eyes. He looks completely beaten down and broken. And look at Eggman's lines too. And you certainly aren't smart enough to defeat me. And you look how Sonic has been fighting a lot in this story, and you can see all he did was dent Eggman's shield. If you look at the shield, that yeah, Sonic wasn't gonna win this. But that art really, the style of the art really sells that. Next, and yet another Tracy Yardley, Jim Almash, Jason Jensen story picture, which is just from that Knuckles comic in Sonic Universe, which just looks really cool. With Knuckles leading the Chaotix and down into Freedom Fighters. But of course, Tracy Yardley wasn't the only artist. There's on the right, we have Jay Axer drawing this cool pinup of Chaos Knuckles fighting Mammoth Mogul. Hey, at least we got one good thing out of Mammoth Mogul in that story. Then on the left, there is by James Fry. There's King Acorn leading the army of Knothole, I guess, into battle, which just looks amazing. And Sonic's line, of course, "Let's do this!" Wish he had said, "Let's do it to it," but beggars can't be choosers, still looked really cool. Then there's this amazing double page splash from Stephen Butler, who is the second best artist the comic had. Stephen Butler's artwork is legendary in Archie Sonic fandom. You can see the detail, all the facial expressions. You can see how Sonic's gritting his teeth. His artwork, above all, just looked really cool. There's not much to say about it, it just looked cool. And of course, probably the most famous image from the comic, Sonic screaming, "Limit? I've got your limit right here!" Which so many people have animated, even people who probably haven't read the comic. And some of these animations have over 1 million views, which is always good to see. I mean, I've heard people take this out of context before, and they think, look at Sonic's ugly expression, which, no. If you understand the context of this moment is super powerful. It's surprising. You can see all the detail in this, the way the waves are splashed around, his crazed expression. It looks amazing. And Tracy Yardley did actually redraw this whole thing by himself back in 2022, so you should try to find it online. It looked really cool. Next, Chapter 3, Lore, and boys, there are a lot of lore. On the left, we have the Robo-Robotnik stuff, which goes, there's Robotnik, he died, but then an alternate reality version of himself, where instead of him dying in that final battle, he roboticized himself, stayed hidden in a satellite, and then killed his version of Sonic, then traveled to the main timeline where the comic takes place, because he thought that main Sonic, who we follow for most of the comic, thinking, okay, he doesn't have an Eggman, and Robotnik and Eggman is thinking, I don't have a Sonic. We need that rivalry in each other's lives. So he pretty much comes here, even though he's already won, just so he can beat up Sonic more. He wants that challenge, that thrill, which really shows how insane he is. And you can say that, doesn't this make the rivalry less impactful because he's a different character? We gotta remember that every single thing the original Robotnik did, this guy did. So whenever Sonic says stuff like, yeah, you've conquered the world all those years ago, he's not wrong. This guy did conquer the world, and all the same things happened. Then there's the lore with Angel Island. In the games, I don't think it's ever explained what happened to Angel Island. I believe it's implied that once the Master Emerald had Chaos Shield inside, it was raised up in the sky to leave so we wouldn't attack the world, which I guess makes sense, but here it's no. As you can see, a giant comet was going to hit Angel Island, or just, I guess, land in this case, since it wasn't an island yet. And it rose up into the sky using the power of 12 Chaos Emeralds. Yes, 12, not 7, don't question it. That's a whole other thing. Which I like getting to see how Angel Island got risen instead of it just being implied. It's always good to get extra lore bits like that. And then there's the stuff with the Great War, the war between the Overlanders and the Mobians. The Overlanders are like humans, but they're not humans. Trust me, we'll get back to that. They only have 4 fingers, not 5, which, okay, eventually in the comic, just everybody gets drawn with 5 fingers for consistency's sake, but that's just an art thing. You can see that there was a huge war between the Mobians and Overlanders, including stuff like Baby Elias Acorn, the prince, getting taken to the Brotherhood of Guardians on Angel Island for safety. And that's definitely an interesting story, but I don't want to get into that now. It was just interesting, I think, they had a war between them, because in the games, you never really get to see humans and Mobians together, which I know it said, oh, they live on different parts of the world, which is also how it works in Archie, but you actually get to see them interact, so it's more than just, yeah, the Sonic cast is, I guess, visiting Soliana and Sonic 06, but they're just treated as being normal folk, which I guess is fine, but I don't know, I guess I just want a little more out of that, and the fact they literally had a war is pretty interesting, and it even ties into Robotnik's rise and all that stuff, which is pretty interesting. Then there is the lore that Knuckles' father had a dream that his son would one day be in danger and that he was a chosen one of destiny, the ultimate bioengineered life form to save the world. Basically just a lengthened version of Shadow's title, The Ultimate Life Form, but before Sonic Adventure 2 released. So, echidnas, I guess, mothers give birth to eggs, or lay eggs, and then the eggs hatch echidnas babies, which, okay. So then it says that Knuckles' father took Knuckles' egg from behind his wife's back and bathed it in chaos energy to give him chaos powers and make him a living Chaos Emerald. Yeah, that's the kind of crazy thing you'll only get in this comic, and yet I don't hate it. I think it's interesting because a lot was done with it. Whether that stuff was executed well is up to you, but it's interesting and it's definitely good for something to at least be interesting. Because I can say this about the comic: until the reboot, it was never boring, which is definitely something IDW really needs to learn. Being terrible is one thing, but being boring does not help. Then there's, yeah, Knuckles becoming a living Chaos Emerald when he becomes green, which that story is very hated among the fans. I actually like it a bit. It's not great, but it's enjoyable. I think there was stuff to enjoy in it. It was interesting to see the conflict of Knuckles joining the Dark Legion, who are talking about rejoining a kin to society, and yeah, that story's pretty interesting. I like it. Then there's the stuff with the Zorda, which, oh my gosh. Okay, so it says that in the 21st century, when the comic was most of it was published, the Zorda aliens came to Earth. They sent an ambassador, but I guess humans did not come in peace, and they took the Zorda ambassador and dissected it. This made the Zorda so mad, they launched a gene bomb that wiped out all of mankind and pretty much everything alive. But eventually, from primordial soup, as the Sonic Comic Encyclopedia says, the life started to reform in the form of the Mobians about 3,000 something years ago, when the comic takes place. And then Overlanders started to appear, which they look just like humans, but they're not humans. And yeah, that's where Mobian life comes from. They just evolved to be what they eventually were. But then in the comic's 10th anniversary story, the Zorda come back to Earth, which is now called Mobius because, the first life to reemerge on the planet didn't have a name for the planet, so they just renamed it Mobius. So yeah, and then the Zorda went to wipe it all out with a gigantic gene bomb, and then actually use the quantum dial to destroy the Earth's entire solar system, which we'll get into later. The point is, this comic literally has Sonic characters fight alien invasions, and it is amazing. Next, this is going to be a brief chapter of the romance part of the comic. Oh boy, this is controversial. So we'll start on the left with Sonic and Sally. I love Sonic and Sally. Yeah, I know some people don't, a lot of people actually, but just all I can say to those people is you can have your opinions, but can you not bully other people for not agreeing with you? I am so sick of these Sonic me for life people. If all you want to do is bully people for not liking your ship, then you need to seriously get a life. I'm sorry. Don't bully other people because they have different preferences in this sort of thing than you. But anyway, yeah, I really like Sonic and Sally. It takes so long for them to get together, and then they break up pretty quickly. But it just their dynamic in general was fun. It was entertaining. It was like in Sad AM. Okay, Sad AM's dynamic was better than most of Archie's, but I like their dynamic in Archie a lot. The people always say, "But Sonic would have to slow down if you went with Sally," which if he ever had a girlfriend, he'd have to slow down. So you can't just say that for Sally. You just hate Sally if you say that. But so Sally is the planner, and then he's the action man in a sense. I guess you could put it that way. So she sits around, he runs. I think that's pretty interesting, and just the fact that Sonic can't just run forward for his entire life. Sometimes he has to slow down. This comic emphasizes that, and I really appreciate that. Then there's Knuckles and Julie Sue's relationship, which is a lot less complex than Sonic and Sally's, but it's pretty enjoyable in and of itself. You're wondering, what about Knuckles and Rouge? Which Rouge is practically a villain in this comic. That would not happen. And this is different continuity, so I guess do its own thing. Rouge didn't even exist when Julie Sue was created, so yeah. Their idea of their characters is a kind of Romeo and Juliet thing where they're from opposing sides that absolutely hate each other. Knuckles is a guardian. Julie Sue's family was part of the Dark Legion. They're able to bridge the gap, not necessarily bridge the gap between them and have the two sides reunite, but rather show that the two sides can reunite. They don't need to be stuck in this centuries-long blood feud, as Dr. Finitivus put it, that has never ended and never shown any signs of ending. And their relationship was just entertaining. They mostly act serious around each other, but they don't need to be all mushy around each other. them just looking at each other or talking to each other just tells you that they're in love. They don't need to say it. They don't need to spell it out for everyone to understand. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And sure, it took a while for the relationship to fully get interesting, I guess, but the more so it had to do with Ken Penders not being able to write convincing emotions aside from anger, I guess. Well, except for Knuckles screaming, "I always knew you were no good," or oh boy, Endgame is awful. But and then there's Bunny and Antoine, original character for the comic, I guess from Sad AM. But since the even though the comics rebooted and all romance was erased because it can't have Sonic having a girlfriend, oh goodness no! Since they weren't created by Sega of Japan, they were still allowed to be married because yeah, they actually got married in the comic, and I like that. Shows the characters mature, they grow up, they have character, they have personality, they have depth. And this is the romance part is just an extension of that. There's not really much to say other than that. They're the opposite of Knuckles and Julie Sue. They're more mushy and lovey-dovey, I guess, but it's also just funny to see. It's kind of like a Gambit and Rogue thing where Gambit has some kind of Cajun accent, Rogue is Southern, and in this case, Bunny's Southern and Antoine is French. It's pretty funny. Not much, again, there's not much to say about this section. I just find it enjoyable. And there's a lot more to go over, like the crazy love triangles. I'm not going to go over the terrible Monkey Kong love triangle. All I'll say is that was a waste of time and it made Monkey Kong one of my least favorite characters. Okay, next, Chapter 5, My Favorite Stories. So we got a 10th anniversary story, Sonic Adventure 2.5, which, yes, was an actual title, and this comic is worthy of that title. Yeah, it's not as good as Sonic Adventure 2. I'd say it's better than 1, but I still like 1. So in short, this has to deal with the Zorda invasion. Sonic and Sally are getting engaged. Well, they wouldn't get married for a few more years, but they're engaged now, I guess. The Zorda make their presence known. We learn the full backstory of how mankind and all other life was wiped out by the Zorda thousands of years ago. And this gets a lot of lore, but it also just shows how big the world is. There's splash pages of Tails flying above everybody with Shadow at the forefront yelling, "Let's do it to it!" Which, yeah, I really like this story. This is part of the way past insanest era, as Lowar and Ian Waffles have coined, and yeah, it definitely fits. I really like this era of the comic. It's so ludicrous and insane, yet it's also pretty charming and endearing. It even has some pretty emotional moments thrown in between there, even if it's mostly just crazy humor. And yeah, this is, by the way, the oldest story I'll mention here, which I like stories from before, like Mecha Madness and Robotnik Returns, but I don't really want to get into those because I don't want this to go for too long, and yeah, just none really hit super hard until this one. Next, we've got Return to Angel Island, also written by Carl Boulders, like most of the Wayne Past Insane era. This story is great. It shows how the Echidna lore is cool if it just has the right writer. Carl Boulders condensed everything that needed to be condensed and expanded on what didn't need to be expanded. For example, Knuckles feeling like the main character. We get a lot of cool new character introductions like Dr. Finitivus and Lienda actually having a character. We get Locke's much better, newer look. We get more stuff about the Dark Legion, and we get to see Super Knuckles, which I wish he was still called Hyper Knuckles, but it must have been a Sega thing. Maybe just something Carl Boulders wanted to do anyway. I don't know, but this story is really fun. Essentially, Sonic this time is the sidekick being thrown to Knuckles in the Chaotic story on Angel Island. And we get to see so much happen in this story, so many crazy expressions and artwork, and this story was drawn by John Gray. I'm not a big fan of John Gray's art. He drew the infamous slap scene, which I don't want to talk about because everyone's talked about that before, but this is the only time where I like his art a lot. Well, aside from that father and son B story I mentioned before with Scourge, but because it emphasizes the craziness of this story, and this was definitely Carl Bowler's best work. He didn't do too much after this. He just did one two-part and then he was gone, but at least he ended on a high note. Then there is Eggman Empire, a trilogy that not even The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars are even close to being as good as. This was where Ian Flynn finally set his status quo for the comic. His earlier work was great, but this is where it just went absolutely crazy. So you can see these covers. The cover 175, a lot of people have seen. Yeah, it's very shocking to see an evil-looking Eggman holding up Sonic in chains, which looks awesome. 177, there's a proud-looking Sonic facing off against Eggman, which I love that cover. But 176 is my favorite cover here. Sonic standing in the burnt remains of Knothole City, holding a tattered King Acorn flag, and gosh, this image is just. This comic has a lot of images that are just burned into my brain, and this is definitely one of them. You can really see his anger. In 175's cover, you don't really see anything, I guess, sadness. 177, you see confidence. 176, you just see defeat and anger. That's an emotion he never gets to experience in the game, at least not that much. In the movies, his emotions are just, oh boy. Then there are just some more miscellaneous ones I want to mention. Okay, House of Cards. That cover is bad, which has permanently damaged the story's reputation. People think, oh, it's just Sonic and Tails fighting over a girl. No, it's not. It's Tails fighting over the fact that it feels like Sonic just doesn't care about him. And maybe he's never really cared about him as much as he's thought all these years. Maybe he's just viewed Tails as a dumb child. And the thing is, Sonic, well, he hasn't entirely. He has been looking down on Tails a bit, and he doesn't even realize it. And Sonic is finally faced with that fact. And the fact they managed to make a compelling political drama in the background of a Sonic comic really speaks to the talent of the writers and artists back then. Then there's the following story, Enerjack Reborn, which is just amazing. I don't really have much to say about it, but you just get to see so much. Knuckles becoming Enerjack, the King Lore coming full circle, stuff with Locke's death and sacrifice, Shadow getting easily beaten by Enerjack even when he takes off his inhibitor rings. The best Supersonic appearance ever. It is so good. You get to see Julie Sue's true anger and emotion during the whole thing that's going on. You get to see a bit from Sally. There's a lot going on in this story. It's genuinely really interesting. And, it sets up a lot of stuff to come afterward. Then there is the Scourge Saga, which is amazing. Again, a lot of these stories are great. As you can see, this is the cover of Super Scourge, and all I want to talk about in this story is it shows that the Freedom Fighters hate Scourge. Why wouldn't they? But their evil doubles hate Scourge even more than they do because he conquered their world. He beat them up. He literally tore out Evil Antoine's eye. Of course, this is just implied, but yeah, that shows how evil he is. And he looks like a demon here with his red eyes and his red pupils and his black eyes and the purple and the crown. And how Sonic doesn't beat him here in a fist fight because there's no way he could. He beats him with his wits, knowing that if on his world, Supersonic gives you a boost, and it's really hard to get the Chaos Emeralds, when you power down, it gives you a boost, yeah. So in Scourge power, it's really easy to get a power up to turn into Super Scourge on his world, so he's thinking, okay, and maybe when you power down, it burns you out, which is exactly what happens, because he tells Scourge, ha, I never need to be in a super form to take you down, and this really gets Scourge mad. He's saying, I've been more than a match for you since day one. I can finish you super or not. And a whole panel of Sonic smirk, smiling up at him and saying, prove it, tough guy. And then Scourge powers down, proving you can still beat him in a fair fight, but as Sonic predicted, it burns Scourge out. And this completely crushes Scourge. He's still obsessed with the fact that he's got to win. He's king, man. And Sonic grabs him, throws him into the mud, and talks him down. Fantastic story. Then there's just issue 222, which is a single story about Sonic and Sally going on their first date after getting back together, which, yeah, I really like this story. The B story with Knuckles is pretty good too, but I like the story. It just shows that not every issue has to have some kind of crazy action set piece. Sometimes it can just be the character's being, and that's plenty entertaining on its own right. Not everything has to be some big, huge event. That's something modern comics definitely face. Well, yeah, this comic had a lot of big multi-part stories. They weren't as nearly as insane as the way they've been doing it for decades with stuff, these crazy events. Civil War was something like over 100 issues. That's such overkill. But this was just a nice, simple story, and there's a lot to be found in that. Their chemistry, Sonic and Sally's chemistry, is showing off greatly here. It's just a lot of fun. Then there's Genesis, and oh boy, yeah, this one's amazing. The 20th anniversary comic that Ian Flynn never even wanted to make and said he'd cut out, but he's glad that people really enjoyed it because he never even liked the story that much to begin with. But It's loved, it's considered one of the comics highlights. I think it's great. I really love it. There's a lot to say about this one. It's so simple, yet there's a lot of complexity in it at the same time. I'm not really sure what to say about it. It's just really enjoyable, and that's that. Excuse me for one moment. Okay, back to the video. And then there's the last comic before you can see the lawsuits from Ken Henders setting in, forcing the comic to be rebooted. So, this issue is just, it's called Unraveling. It even says so on the cover. That's what happens. Jeffrey St. John, who, oh gosh, has such a great character arc in the Flynn era, he's finally able to stand up to Ixis completely and not want to be his puppet anymore, and realizes all the terrible things he's done and let Nagus done. Except it shows that sometimes you can't escape your mistakes. You've made mistakes, you face the consequences. You get possessed by Ixis and yeah, unless you read the fan continuation, which is great, that's just how Jeffrey's arc ends. A sad, broken man got possessed by a crazy, evil wizard that he brought back. Which, side note about Ixnagis, I can't be the only one who wishes Robin Atkin Downs could voice him someday, right? Then there are some Sonic Universe stories. Okay, the Shadow Saga I've mentioned before is amazing. This is the story where Omega finally appears, and yeah, Gamma is there with Shadow and Omega. I'm not gonna spoil this one because I have to say, if you're gonna read any Archie Sonic comic, okay, there are better ones, but read Sonic Universe issue 3. Just read the whole Shadow Saga, actually, the first 4 issues of the comic. You are not going to regret it. Trust me, it's amazing. Then there was Knuckles the Return, as it says on the cover. The graphic novel says Knuckles Returns. The inside says Echoes of the Past. I'm just going to say Echoes of the Past because that sounds cooler. So this is him returning to Angel Island again, but this time having to face history he just absolutely knows nothing about and wanting to know the answers. And Finidivus hangs him over Knuckles' head. He tells him he can teach him everything he ever wanted to know, but if he just joins him in obliterating all of life and starting over, he's pretty much just an even more insane and far more interesting version of Thanos. But Knuckles obviously says no way and punches Finidivus in the face, and thinking at the end of the story, even if there are things he doesn't know, he's happy, and that's what really matters. Sure, he'd like to know more about his past, but he doesn't need to, and that's that. That's pretty powerful, I'd say. Then there's this really funny cover of Cream riding Shadow's motorcycle. Hey, it's popular among fans as a joke of Shadow teaching Cream how to use a gun for some reason. So this just has her driving his bike with sunglasses, which is pretty funny. This is Treasure Team Tango, which is just insanity, and it's amazing. You see Team Rose, or in this case, there's no Big the Cat, though. Instead, it's Blaze the Cat. The Babylon Rogues, the hooligans of Knack, Bean, and Bark, and yes, I'm calling him Knack the Weasel, not Fang the Sniper, Fang the Hunter. That name is stupid. And in the comic, he's called Knack, anyway. And yeah, this team originated from here. It didn't originate from Sonic Superstars or Sonic Mania or IDW. No, it came from here. And you also get to see a lot of Team Dark, and it goes to show that, yeah, even if Shadow might be a little cold, he'll still do whatever it takes to protect the world, even if it gets in the way of his missions with guns. I really like that. It shows that, yeah, Shadow is a hero, no doubt about that. It's also his final appearance pre-reboot, and really good way for him to go out. And yeah, we get more of the Babylon Rogues, and I can just say this. People know who Bean and Bark are, but nobody really knows anything about them. So, here in the comic, Bark is portrayed as silent and I guess the straight man to Bean, and Bean is completely insane. He's practically like Wacko from Animaniacs, except even more insane, who, if Bean ever gets a voice, it better be Jess Arnell, I'll say that much. So, Bean is just completely wacky, saying all sorts of random stuff. He knows the Babylon Rogues, and we never know how he knows what happened between him and them, but it's kind of like a Noodle incident story, which, you know, if you read Calvin and Hobbes, you know what I'm talking about. Stuff like Han Solo saying, "It did the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs." A kind of story you don't know about, but you hear about. That kind of thing. Then, there are some more universe stories. I already mentioned the Silver Saga with Silver versus Enerjack, which is great. I mentioned the Scourge storyline. Scourge Lockdown, and the inside of the comic says it's Inside Job, which I think is a better title. And back to the inside of these comics have different titles on the cover. For the Silver Saga, it's Fractured Mirror. Anyway, I'm just gonna briefly mention Scourge Lockdown. It further ties into them mentioning Eggman Nega that never goes anywhere, which I guess makes sense because there was no time for it, but wish I got to see what happened with Eggman Nega because according to the Sonic Comic Encyclopedia, we don't know if he's from Silver's future, which is probably more likely, or from Blaze's dimension, and instead he's probably even smarter than Eggman, which is definitely something I want to see explored. Don't know about you though. The comic also shows the Destructics backstory. Before, the Destructics were just loser goons. They weren't awful, it's just that why would you care about the Destructics? And then you see their origins and think, okay, yeah, I really care about these characters now. They're not necessarily sympathetic, I mean, especially not flying frogs, but it just gives you a sense that, yeah, these are people, they're not just faceless goons to get beat up. Then there's Scramble, which has the scene of Eggman locking Snively in a pod. And this story just shows how evil Eggman is and how he's always on top of everybody. No matter how hard you try, you cannot escape the Eggman. Next, there's the Secret Freedom Fighter story, which is absolutely amazing and one of the best. Which a lot of these stories are one of the best, but you get some fun stuff from Silver, from Shard, who we'll talk about a little bit later. There's stuff from Elias Acorn, from Larry Lynx, from Lita and Lyco, from Jeffrey Nixus Nagas, and the scene where Silver talks to Jeffrey is probably the best scene in the entire comic, which is a pretty tall, pretty high bar. So, yeah. Then there's issue 50, which you think would be about Metal Sonic, but instead it's about Shard facing off against Metal Sonic. If you're watching this video, you know who Shard is, so I'm not going to mention him, but I'm not going to go into his origin. But in short, it shows Shard's mental state, how much he goes through. We got to see him falling in love with Nicole, which I really liked. Wish we got to see more of that. Dang, reboot. You're gonna see his brotherly bond with Metal Sonic almost. How Shard is the older brother, the one that was able to learn from his mistakes. He was allowed to, but Metal Sonic, he was programmed to just be a machine, to be a lifeless, evil murderer. And at the end of the day, well, Shard self-destructs to blow both of them up. Metal Sonic is rebuilt and survives, and that, well, Shard probably died. He might not have. We'll never know. But yeah, it's sad. I mean, especially when Metal Sonic flies into a hospital about to kill a comatose Antoine, and Shard tells him, "Really, Sleeping Beauty here? There is no challenge. Let's settle this bot to bot, mecha to metal, brother to brother." And Metal Sonic just stops and says, "Brother, challenge accepted." That's all he needs to hear. It shows that maybe Metal Sonic does have some humanity left in him, but he's still just broken. Or how back in the Shadow Saga, Shadow told Metal Sonic, you're a living weapon like me. You can be more than an Eggman robot though. You can save the world. You don't need to be a murderous killing machine." But Metal Sonic just says, "We are not different. We are both living weapons, but I was programmed to do that, so that's what I'm going to do." And when Shard just is beaten up and asks, "That really is all you're gonna ever do, isn't it?" He says to Metal Sonic, "You can be more than just a weapon or a tool, right? Take it from me." And Metal Sonic thinks about what Shadow told to him, but it just doesn't work. He's too set in his ways. And it's tragic. This comic is a tragedy. And then the only reboot story I'll mention is another Silver story. This one was written by Evan Stanley, actually, which, outside of Ghost of the Future, her fan comic, it's the only Evan Stanley comic I like. Well, instead of a few stories about Silver and IDW, which really shows how great she was at writing Silver, if that says anything. But this story is pretty much it's about seeing Silver living in a dystopian future where everyone's ruled by some kind of crazy council, and we get one of my all-time favorite Silver lines. "It's no use. I'm sick of hearing people say that." Yeah, you tell him, Silver. Only a person like Evan Stanley, who's actually a big fan of Silver, would be willing to write a line like that. Well, except for me, but I'm not an official writer. Great story, though. Then, Chapter 6, the people that worked on it. First, we've got Ian Flynn on the left, which there's a lot to say about Ian Flynn. I love his older writing, but his work on IDW and Frontier, especially IDW, is it's really bad. I don't want to be negative, so I'm not really going to talk about IDW, but Flynn has literally said that he doesn't like his older stories from Archie, which what? The comic, his tragic, fun, adventurous deep comics with so many layers going on, and so they were so much fun. It had such great artwork. He views as being bad, and yet him ripping off Scourge, a character he created, he is more proud of. He's more proud of Tangle the lemur than, I don't know, Shard or something, which, gosh, I hate Tangle. Then in the middle, there's Tracy Yardley, the best Sonic artist ever. We already mentioned him. Then there's Jim Amash, who I also mentioned. These inkers are really important to comics, and Jim Amash did so many. He even did a little bit for IDW. Then there's Jason Jensen on the left, who was the colorist, as I mentioned before. He did a lot, and the color is really important. It really made the stories he drew, colored pop. Very nice. Then there is Stephen Butler in the middle, who, again, as I mentioned before, his artwork was just really cool. That's all there is to say about it. And he worked on the comic for a long time. I guess after doing the Clone Saga for Spider-Man, it was probably best for him to leave Marvel. Then there's Patrick Spaziante, the man who worked on this comic from 1995 till its end in 2017. Now that's commitment. I'm not as big a fan of his artwork as some other people are, but it's still really good. He was very important to the comic. Then there are some other writers. Okay, Carl Bowler's on the left, and yeah, I don't even need to say that's Ken Penders. You all know what he looks like. To talk about Carl Bowler's really quickly, I'll say this. He's even admitted that his early stories weren't good, and yeah, they weren't, but he was really proud of a lot of the stories he did, and yeah, I think a lot of his stories were really good. I think they were way better than people say they were. There's not much to say about a lot of these people, it's just that what there is to say means a lot. Then there's Ken Penders. Yeah, the fact that he got to draw the DVD cover for Sad AM, and also a few years before was responsible for another one of the series' potential revivals. Yeah, that is all kinds of wrong. But anyway, I I don't know what to say about Ken Penders that hasn't already been said, but also I don't even know what to think of him because I don't hate his stories as much as other people do. I like some of them. But then you have stuff like Endgame, which, yeah, as mentioned before, Knuckles saying, "I always knew you were no good," or "Dragons cannot tell lies, as you know, so you know Sonic is innocent." Oh, brother. Yeah, I know Jeffrey St. John got good under Carl Bowlers and Ian Flynn, but let's stay away from Ken Pender's version of him. And yeah, he just could not write convincing emotions, and the whole lawsuit he did was just he got the comic rebooted, and that was awful. But I don't hate his stories, and I know he was super overworked too. But I don't even know what to say about him. I guess we'll just move on from that. And Chapter 7, the conclusion, with this fantastic panel by Yardley, Amash, and Jensen. So in conclusion, I really love Archie Sonic. I understand that some people don't, but I think it earned the title of the world's most way past cool comic. Yeah, there are other great comics, The Amazing Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, but when you look at how many bad stories those comics had compared to how many this had, and this comic lasted 24 years, it's the longest running licensed comic book of all time. It ran for 290 issues of the main series alone. It was very impressive, and it was also apparently very successful because sure, if you look at its sales, you just think, oh, it only sold about 7,000 copies per issue, but that was just in America. And it was published in, that was just in comic book shops. It was Archie comics have sold so well because they were in grocery stores. The average amount of copies and issues sold was probably something closer to, I don't know, 30,000, which might be a little much, but that's more than some comics get these days. In fact, a lot of comics, so that's all I have to say about Archie Sonic. I'll probably talk about it some other time, but as Sonic would say, keep on juicing. That's all for now. See you later.